I'd like to bring up Mr. David Cobb.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. And as I was sharing with Natalie and Kevin and Farron, the public interest public service program are the kind of lawyers I like to work with. I think it was really telling and something that I was very excited about when Natalie first contacted me, because she suggested the title, How Democratic Are Elections in the United States of America? And I thought that that was an incredibly provocative title to suggest, and one that I immediately got excited about, because frankly, that is my position. That is, elections are not democratic in the United States of America. In fact, the United States of America is not now, nor has it ever been, a truly functioning democracy. There have been moments where it has been more democratic. There have been times where there have been great social movements to make it more democratic. But at the end of the day, the United States is not a democracy. And that's a statement that for many people seems shocking. It angers some people, but it is a position that I take with great confidence. I've written up the four sort of main concepts that I want to try to cover. And I do want to give a formal lecture, but also open up the space for some real dialogue, because I know that we have law students here. We probably have some practicing lawyers in the crowd. We've got community members. And I'd like to create this as a dialogue on how we might actually begin the process of forging a more vibrant democracy movement in the United States. So very simply, democracy. What's the word mean? Somebody shout it out. People know. That is a definition. But if we were to break down the word, right? Democracy, demos kratia. What do those words come from? Say it louder.
Ruled by the people.
Exactly. Demos is the people, kratia is rule. So I will suggest to you that we the people do not rule in this society. Today, unelected and unaccountable corporate CEOs are making the fundamental public policy decisions. We, the people, are left to choose between paper or plastic at the grocery store, or between two preconceived, prepackaged candidates for office. Now, before we get into some of the sort of legal constructs behind it, let's actually just take a moment and acknowledge that if voting every 2 or 4 years is the sum total of your exercise of power, that is a very anemic exercise of power. To go and pull a lever once every 2 or 4 years is not a very powerful way to exercise your sovereignty. And what does sovereignty mean? Who rules, right? That is the very and it's built into the whole world, the whole notion of democracy. I'll tell you, quite frankly, thinking of elections as the sum total of democracy is a bit like buying a book that says, How to Get Rich. And people say, I'd like to get rich. I'll buy that book. And you buy the book. Very hungrily, you read the book because you want to get rich. And you realize, wait a minute, this book actually describes to me how I can work my butt off in a grassroots organizing campaign, get somebody else rich, and then gives me suggestions and strategies on how to go and convince that rich person how to do something that I might want them to do. So at the end of the day, if we were really serious about democracy in this country, we would be about creating institutions and decision-making processes by which we, the people, would be able to create the society that we want to live in. I mean, pop quiz. How many people in this audience are eating genetically modified foods? Raise your hand. Right. See, this is the thing. Go into places like the University of Oregon Law School. You spoil my joke, right? You spoil the punchline. Because every single hand in this audience went up. So why did your hands go up when I asked, who's eating genetically modified foods?
Because we have no idea what they don't label it.
They don't label it.
Because the ballot initiative failed in 2000.
To be more precise, look, at the end of the day, you all raised your hands because you are eating genetically mutated organisms. You can't help it, right? There's no way not to eat genetically modified foods in this country. So let me ask you, who made that decision? I would argue to you that the public food supply is one of the most important public policy decisions that might be made. And who made that very public policy decision to put genetically modified food in the food supply? Corporations. Archer Daniels Midland Corporation, Pioneer Hybrid Corporation, Monsanto Corporation. And get it. Check it out. They made that public decision behind private corporate boardroom doors. They claim that that was a purely private decision, and we the people were not only allowed, or were not allowed to be engaged in the process by which the decision was made, we didn't even know the decision was going to be made until after the fact, and now we're working diligently to beg on bended knee, please will you at least label the stuff. I mean, again, that is not really what a sovereign people would do. If we were taking sovereignty seriously, we would actually be defining what we thought our public food supply would look like. And I'll be honest, I don't think democracy means David Cobb wins, as much as I would like it to mean. But I do think that it would mean that there would be a process by which ordinary people could actively engage in creating those institutions and making those kind of public policy decisions. Today, we are not making those decisions. Unelected and unaccountable corporate CEOs are making those decisions. And in fact, they're not only making those decisions, they're making decisions on what our transportation choices will be. They're making decisions on what our healthcare choices are going to be. They make decisions on what our electoral choices will be. And ever more today are they beginning the process of privatizing the entire election process. This is astounding. Private corporations are beginning to own as claimed proprietary software the machines upon which votes are tabulated, the machines upon which votes are actually counted, and even today, the latest onslaught of corporations, they are beginning the process of claiming proprietary ownership of voter database rolls, voter registration rolls. It is astounding the degree to which the corporate onslaught on elections are taking place, and I would suggest that voting, elections, are the very infrastructure of democracy. If we're going to take representative democracy seriously at all, we must have a system by which we, the people, are able to control our own election process. So, as we continue this process, now, that's my sort of critique of the sort of corporatist state and the corporate onslaught of public institutions. But even in terms of elections, I would suggest to you our voting systems are woefully undemocratic. I mean, did you know, for example, that it was easier for people to get on the ballot in the recent sham elections in Iraq than it was for Green Party or Libertarian Party or Constitution Party or other alternative parties in this country to just get on the ballot? In Texas, it required 75,000 signatures to be collected. And those signatures had to come from people who were registered to vote, but had chosen not to vote in either the Democratic or Republican Party primary. So you had to care enough to be willing to register to vote, but be just disenfranchised enough that you don't bother to do it. So that's the universe from people who have to, from whom you can actually collect the signatures. Oh, and you had 75 days to do it. And in fact, in most states, if you actually go back through and look at the hidden history of so-called ballot access laws, you can actually find that the reason these hurdles, these obstacles to participation get put into place is because alternative parties start to have some success. In Texas, for example, some folks might remember La Raza Unida, which was a Latin American, mostly Mexican immigrant and recent immigrants led political party that came out of South Texas, Corpus Christi, that began to organize. And they actually began to elect people at the county level. They began to challenge for state legislative races and were gearing up to run for the state offices, governor, lieutenant governor, etc. And the Democratic Party, which was at that time in control of the state house, simply revamped the election code and installed or inserted these new barriers to even be on the ballot. And I will say, whether you think the Green Party is a good thing, a bad thing, whether you think the Constitution Party or Libertarian Party, can we at least get some agreement that we ought to at least allow alternative voices to participate in the process in this country? I mean, it seems like a bare damn minimum if we're going to actually claim that our elections are democratic, that will at least allow other people to participate. And it's not just the structural access to the being on the ballot. Let's remember also that you have a situation in process where today the two political parties have basically begun hijacking access to the debates. How many people here saw me on the debates in 2004? All right, that was a gimme. How many people here, honest question, how many people here knew that I was arrested for nonviolent civil disobedience trying to participate in those debates? There's one hand. A couple of hands go up. And my argument was that not only did I have a constitutional First Amendment free speech right to participate in the debates because I was qualified, I was on the ballot in 40 states across this country, but frankly that the American people had a right to hear opposing views. Because without me or the Libertarian Party candidate or independent candidate Ralph Nader, there would be, and there was in fact, nobody in those debates arguing to end the war in Iraq. There was nobody arguing for single-payer universal health care as a fundamental human right. There was nobody arguing that the minimum wage should be raised to a living wage so that everybody who works can make enough money to raise their family in dignity. There was nobody on the ballot who was willing to make the argument that we should begin to dismantle and deconstruct the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and basically the institutions of corporate capitalism which have basically enslaving the global South and people of color throughout the world, all to benefit a few corporate executives. There was nobody to challenge the notion of the No Child Left Behind Act. There was nobody to challenge any of, and it's really amazing whenever you sort of look through it. I will not suggest that there's no difference between John Kerry and George Bush. There's a difference. But how many ways are they similar? Right? I mean, it's really astounding. And can we really suggest that in a country of 300 million people that only two political parties are going to be able to capture the rich diversity of opinion that exists in this country? So there is access to the ballot. There is access to the debates. And by the way, the League of Women Voters no longer actually are responsible for the presidential debates. It is actually a very public-sounding organization called the Commission on Presidential Debates. Anybody know who the Commission on Presidential Debates actually is?
I think it's two different major parties.
It is the chair of the Democratic National Committee and the chair of the Republican National Committee. They have given themselves a very public-sounding name, but the two major political parties have basically agreed to take over the debate process so that they can control every aspect of it. And I will suggest to you that the presidential debates in the United States of America are no longer debates. They are at best staged, managed photo opportunities. Every single detail, including the topics that would be allowed to be discussed, had to be pre-cleared by both political candidates. The last time the League of Women Voters actually conducted the debates, Ross Perot was allowed to participate. And again, regardless of what you think about Ross Perot's position on the issues, because of, well, two things. One, because he was a billionaire and had that much money to pay media. And secondly, because he was on the debates, he was able to get 19% of the vote in 1992. And isn't it interesting, y'all, that just before that election, the big issue for Perot and his supporters was the balanced budget. And Democrats blamed Republicans for the lack of the balanced budget because they said Republicans wouldn't raise taxes. Republicans blamed Democrats because they said Democrats wouldn't make cuts on social services, right? I mean, so they were playing a political football game back and forth. There had been roughly 2 decades of that political football game going. Every year, the deficit getting higher and higher. Ross Perot gets on the ballot, gets on the debates, gets 19% of the vote, and the very next year, the budget got balanced. Suggesting that when an alternative political perspective is able to garner enough support, it can literally change the direction of the country. Now, and it's not just recent history. Think about this. Every systemic structural change in this country had to be championed by alternative political parties. The abolition of slavery, women getting the right to vote, the creation of the Social Security Administration, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation laws, pure food and drug laws, ending child labor. Hell, the entire fabric of what all Americans today would agree to be the bare damn minimum for a just and compassionate society, that fabric had to be woven together by alternative political parties. People who did their work when they were called naive and unrealistic, people who did their work when they were called dangerous un-Americans, and people who did their work when they were called spoilers. Right? Because that's what the establishment parties always say when there are maverick challenges outside of the establishment two-party system. And let's be clear about this, folks. They're called establishment parties for a reason, because they promote and protect the interest of the establishment. If you want to see structural systemic change in this country, very bluntly, you are not going to see it championed from within the hallways of power. You are not going to see it championed from within the Democratic National Committee or the Republican National Committee. In fact, if we take a look at all those other great moves forward today that all Americans, regardless of their ideology, would agree to be good things, right? I mean, nobody on any side of the political spectrum says, I think we should reconsider slavery. Right? Nobody, out loud anyway, says, women getting to vote, we should rethink that. Right? I mean, and I don't say that it's worth a laugh, right? I mean, it's kind of funny to say it that way, but think about it. There was a time when that was not only a difficult thing to do, it was considered completely just crazy, right? To challenge those kind of things. And look at what it takes throughout all of U.S. history. First thing is that ordinary people look at their own culture and they say, it doesn't have to be this way. We don't think that this is right. And they begin to organize, right? They begin to talk to one another. And do not underestimate the profound importance and value of having conversation with each other, right? I'm very serious about that. I mean, so many times do I hear people talk about, you're just preaching to the choir, or you're only in conversation with people who agree with you. Let me tell you something, man. My grandfather was a Southern preacher. And so I know this to be a fact. When the choir comes together, the choir wants to sing. And the progressive choir in this country needs some choir practice, y'all. I mean, we need to get together and have honest dialogue and conversation about what it is that we really want. And so that first step of just having conversation has always been what it took to make systemic change in this country. But then they began to talk and they realized, well, you know what? We have elections. We have elected representatives. We should actually go to these elected representatives and tell them what they want. And so they go to the establishment parties of their day and they say, hey, listen, we'd like to make these changes. And the two dominant political parties throughout all of American history have always reacted either one of two ways to demands for systemic change. Either they say, we'd like to do that. That's really sweet, but it's very naive and unrealistic. We really can't do that. Please go away. We have very important work to do. Or they say, well, you want to do what? Well, you're a dangerous un-American. What are you, some kind of socialist? Or communist? Or anarchist? Or today they might say, terrorist? Go away! We can't even allow you to be heard in the body politic. But don't you see, folks, that the establishment parties always, ultimately say the same thing. Go away. They told that to the abolitionists. They told that to the women's movement. First wave feminists. They told that to the trade unionists who were organizing when it was against the law. It was both against state and federal law to organize trade unions in this country. Right? They told that to the civil rights folks. They told that to the environmental movement. In fact, every single movement in this country has been ultimately rejected by the establishment parties. So today, let's not just take a moment from historical accuracy to acknowledge that those people didn't go away. Let's actually applaud them. Let's have some gratitude for the fact that people before us did not go away. They did not give up. They continued to educate, to agitate, to organize, and ultimately they realized what I have realized, and that is that it's going, as difficult as it is in this country, that they had to create their own political party, that they were going to have to run candidates for office challenging this social, political, and economic system. And even though the barriers were put in front of them, they said, ya basta, enough already. We're not going to accept this country the way it is. And because of people like that, we have a different world today. And frankly, as a lawyer, and I know that many in this hall are lawyers as well, let's acknowledge that they were also willing to violate unjust laws. Elizabeth Cady Stanton did not merely agitate for the right to vote after Seneca Falls. She went and voted, even though it was against the law for her to do so, and she was arrested as a result. And let's be grateful that she did. Right? History honors none above those who are willing to violate unjust laws. Hell, when I ran for office, I ran on my arrest record for nonviolent civil disobedience. I'm proud of the fact that I've been to jail for justice. And I'll be very candid with you, I expect before it's said and done, I'll go to jail again. It's not, and to tell you the truth, I know we're being recorded, so shh. But when you go to jail for justice, it feels good. It really does. How many people are comfortable acknowledging publicly that you've ever engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience and either gone to jail or been willing to risk arrest? Do I tell the truth? Does it feel good? Did it feel empowering? Say hell yeah like you mean it. Yeah! And every single movement before us recognized that they had to be willing to engage in that exact process. Now, so we've talked about sort of structural, and then the last part, of course, is the media. So I'm so glad to see that I think that we've got some people's media in the house today. But I can't help but to notice that corporate media is absent. And of course, it doesn't surprise us, right? ABC and CBS are in actual fact General Electric Corporation, Westinghouse Corporation, and the Disney Corporation, right? So it doesn't surprise me that corporate media makes it a point to ridicule, mock, and marginalize voices like mine and the Green Party, right? They don't want you to hear this message. And so you don't. At least not on regular corporate media. And in fact, the reality is that even though the airwaves may belong to the people, the press in this country, we have a free press to the same exact extent that you own a press. Right? So if you own a television station, if you own a radio station, if you own a newspaper, you are free to put anything in it you like. And for those folks who are constantly complaining about the liberal media in this country, it sort of makes me chuckle because I point out, I think the media is just exactly as liberal as the rich billionaires who own it. Right? And I want to be clear, I don't think that we have a liberal media, but likewise, I don't think that we have a particularly conservative media. We have a corporate media. And that media, their real product is you. The viewer, the listener, delivering you to their advertisers. Newspapers, news magazines, news programs on radio or television are not in the business of actually supplying news and information. That's the hook to get you to watch it. The actual business model is about selling advertising space, right? And the advertising space is your very mind. And you know what really gets me about that? This generation of Americans, of which I am one, right? We are the most tested group of human beings that have ever walked the face of the earth. We have been probed and examined by psychologists, by experts, by statisticians, and they really understand and know what it is that we want. And what's really interesting is if you strip it away and find out what is it that people really want, What they want are status. They want to belong to a community. They want to be acknowledged and recognized for their work, meaningful work that they do. They do seem to want a fair amount of sex. They also, though, most importantly, want to be, their entire sort of sense of being is in relation to other people, right? What they want is status. What they want is to be looked up to. What they want, and whenever you sort of describe it that way, it's really sort of sweet. I mean, we as hairless apes are, a communitarian species. It's kind of sweet. And what's really sick, what's really twisted, what really boils me is that these elites then take that knowledge and that information and they say, now we need to get the best magicians and wizards of our society, right? The true artists. That is, advertisers. And we want you to cast a spell. We want you to mesmerize people. We want you to convince people that to get the things that they want, to feel the things that they really want, to feel fully human and alive, to get that feeling, convince them they got to buy some crap. Right? And you know what's really interesting about that buying of crap? It is like crack cocaine, because the moment of satisfaction is only in the acquisition, right? It's not even having the stuff, right? I mean, so you're getting convinced that, man, I really want this. I really, really, really want to get this thing. I got it. And then it's nothing. So I want the next thing, and you get it, and you get it, and then it's meaningless. And so we spend our entire lives in this sort of voracious desire to accumulate more and more things. And so many people today find themselves in a big house full of a lot of crap and they're not happy. That's a hell of a dilemma, isn't it? And I would suggest to you that the corporate media is specifically and intentionally designing you to think that way. Me. And I'm not sort of saying, oh, I am the enlightened one and I'm here to educate you. Let me be very clear that I suffer from it probably as much or not more than almost anybody else. And so it's a really interesting phenomenon to realize that the culture and society in which I live is really, it's like the Matrix. And there's a level at which I sometimes sort, man, I wish I had back to the blue pill. You know, it was a lot easier back whenever I thought, well, it's either Democrat or Republican, and I'll be a Democrat because they're the good ones, and I want, good things. And I'm going to become a lawyer because I want to, work for justice, and that's where it happens, and the legal system is designed in order to ensure that justice gets done. Well, in case you haven't figured it out yet, it is my position as a member of that great and noble school of thought known as critical legal studies that the legal system is designed to promote and protect the interest of the elite. And in fact, as a lawyer who practiced for 9 years in courts in Texas, let me tell you that stare decisis be damned. If you were up against a real case, 9 times out of 10, it had to do with the political realities. And I could tell you which side was going to win and which side was going to lose. All right? Hell, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes is the one who is famous for having said, "Look to the courts of heaven if you want justice. Here we only want consistency." And of course, it's interesting that consistency always seems to favor the ruling elite. And now I say that, having gone through law school, glad that I have a law degree, and I want to say also to the Public Interest Public Service Program, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for being here. Thank you, the students who are part of the Public Interest Public Service. And yes, we do desperately need you to be lawyers. Don't come away from this saying, gosh, I listened to David Cobb, now I'm going to quit law school. No! Stay. The legal profession desperately needs people like you. Desperately do we need more people like you. Recruit your colleagues and friends to actually come and think about using their legal education and, in fact, their legal career to actually advance justice, because that's actually, at its most noble, that's what the profession ought to be about. Now, so, my critique is that we do not have a democratic society. More focused, elections in the United States of America are not very democratic. And yet and still, I engage in electoral politics. I engage in social movement work. In fact, just before coming, just yesterday, the local group I worked with, we launched a campaign to go into low-income community in Eureka, California, where I live, where we are conducting a survey, asking people what matters to them, including trying to register them to vote. So I totally believe in engaging in electoral politics. But let me tell you this, folks. If you want systemic change and all you ever do is vote every 2 to 4 years, you're wasting your time. If you want change and all you ever do is vote, you are wasting your time. But there's a corollary to that. And that is, if you want systemic change and you don't bother to vote, you're wasting an opportunity. Right? I mean, I guess what I'm suggesting is we need to be able and willing to use all the tools in the toolbox. And every other movement before us knew that. And it is true that it was movements before us. And I think that that's what I find most distressing today, is that most people who want systemic change either think that elections are the sum total of democracy, and so they put all of their civic energy into elections, or, and the folks know people like that, right? They're all about elections, and that's like all they talk about in terms of like if politics comes up, they think it automatically means elections. And then there's another group of people who think that elections are for chumps. Right? They want systemic change, but they say anybody who's engaging in elections is wasting their time, shouldn't be involved in it at all. To which I say to both of these groups of people, of course you're both right. Which means, of course, they're both wrong. Right? I mean, and so the difficult position that I find myself in, and I hope others do too, is that kind of push-pull, a kind of creative tension around how can we engage in electoral politics in a way that is principled, that has integrity, and that also can begin the process of making elections meaningful. Because really, y'all, if elections at the end of the day just comes down between choosing between two prepackaged candidates who have already gone through a filter that meets the acceptable criterion of the ruling elite, that's not a very empowering prospect. Right? So the question, and to me, even though I don't think elections are very democratic, I definitely get engaged in elections. And I also would suggest this. The most powerful manner to engage in elections is at the local level. Here in Eugene, here in your county, I mean, the reality is that there will be progressive candidates for office that would need your support and your help. And that includes door knocking, that includes telephone canvassing, that includes assisting as lawyers, and it also finally and ultimately includes making sure that people are allowed to vote when they try. Because I do want to, I would be remiss if I didn't include in my talk before we open it up to questions, my personal position that George W. Bush steals elections. You know, you can clap for that. I mean, it's so true. It's so obvious. It's so patently obvious, and nobody's willing to say it. But George W. Bush stole the 2000 election. He was never elected president in 2000. And we know that. And in fact, the theft of that election actually culminated in the Supreme Court when the Supreme Court selected George Bush. But it actually began about 8 months prior when George W. Bush's brother Jeb Bush engaged in an intentional, systematic effort to disenfranchise African American voters and kick them off the rolls. On purpose. With malice aforethought did that happen. And ultimately, the Supreme Court decision in Bush versus Gore was, as Bugs Bunny would say, only the coup de grace. Right? In fact, I would suggest to you that was a judicial coup d'etat. And in this country, like in other countries when there's a coup, the people march out in the streets, bang pots and pans. A movement erupts. It's of course, and in this country, people said, that's just shocking. I wonder what's on television. And so, you know, I got to say, shame on Al Gore for not fighting to secure the election that he won. And also, shame on the American people for not pouring out into the streets. And frankly, in 2004, I suspect George Bush stole another election. We'll never know with the same certainty in 2000, because I can say that, and I always love to sort of flash my bar card at this point and say, anybody who thinks this is slanderous, just sue me, because truth is an absolute defense, and I would love to have subpoena power and get sued making statements like this, right? I welcome you, right? In the South we say, please don't throw me in that briar patch, right? I would love it. But think about this. In 2004, I believe that George Bush stole another election. I mean, we know that he stole 2000 because actually, even though voters were disenfranchised in Florida, even with that, all the votes were actually finally counted. And who got the most votes in Florida? Gore. I mean, did y'all know that? Right? I mean, that's kind of important, right? And in 2004, we don't know. What we do know is this, that there were lines in low-income, people of color communities that were 5, 6, and 7 hours long, and only 5, 7 miles away, the lines were 15 minutes. Why? Because decisions being made by the Secretary of State, who happened to be on the George W. Bush re-election campaign, had made decisions about allocating voting machines in such a way. We know that happened for a fact. We know for a fact that there were counties, not just precincts, but counties where more people voted for George Bush than were registered to vote. We know for a fact that people made complaints on electronic voting machines where they would try to cast a vote for one candidate and the machine would display George Bush's name. We know all of these things for a fact. Now, we were never able to actually prove it because when at the end of the election cycle, when all these reports came pouring in, I was looking forward to going to Zihuatanejo, Mexico. Right? I had worked my butt off trying to help grow and build the Green Party, and I was literally getting ready to leave the country and go and lay on a beach. And our office was literally flooded with people screaming, yelling, and begging about what had happened in Ohio. And everybody assumed, and I assumed, that John Kerry would fight to secure that election as well. After all, he was sitting on $10 million. Right, that he had raised specifically for litigation battles and recounts that they thought were going to happen. And John Kerry didn't just concede that night, he capitulated. Because John Kerry wanted to be president. I do believe that. But you see, John Kerry, just like Al Gore before him, valued his continued membership in good standing with the rest of the ruling elite more than he valued the integrity of the election results. And so just as Al Gore was unwilling to challenge that, John Kerry was unwilling to challenge that because he knew that it would require exposing how fundamentally undemocratic elections are in the United States of America. And he was not willing to do it. So we had to do it, raising $25, $50 at a time to raise almost $200,000 just to go through a recount process. And ultimately, we were never able to get a genuine recount. How many of you know, by the way, that there were actually criminal indictments and prosecutions and convictions of people, you knew, that there were actually convictions in Ohio because the recount never took place under Ohio election law. And people who raised your hand, you're geeks. The fact that you knew that means that you are totally political junkie geeks. Because it was never on public media. It was never in the corporate media. The only place that was covered was Democracy Now!, community radio station. Y'all get KBOO here, maybe? Or no? No, too bad. So y'all have some community radio here, I imagine.
KWVA, a little bit of it.
All right, so but I'll tell you this. The only reason that we even know that was because of community radio stations, because of Democracy Now! And the Pacifica Network. And if it had not been for those last remnants of genuine democratic media, we wouldn't have even been able to get the word out and be able to launch that campaign. So, at the end of the day, I don't believe elections are very democratic in this country, but I totally engage with them because I engage in any and every tool necessary to confront the reality of a racist, sexist, homophobic, class-oppressive society in which we live. And you know what? I know with absolute certainty that my side will ultimately prevail. The arc of the universe may be long, but it bends towards justice. And every single time that you take a look throughout at least U.S. history, to just keep it within a framework that we can see, the side of a more peaceful, a more just society, ultimately we end up winning. It may take time. It always does, in fact, but we ultimately always win. I want to conclude with these words. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. You show me the exact amount of injustice that a people are willing to tolerate, and I will show you the exact amount of injustice that will be visited upon them. Frederick Douglass said those words 150 years ago, and it's as true today as it was then. And so, frankly, folks, if we want to confront an illegal, immoral, and unconstitutional war in Iraq, if we want to stop a war in Iran before it gets underway, if we want to demand single-payer universal health care as a fundamental human right in this country, if we want to see a literally different world today, we have got to be willing to take up that struggle for justice with the same level of conviction that the abolitionists did, that the women's suffrage movement did, that the trade union movement did, that the civil rights movement did, and that the environmental movement has begun to do. Peace and go Ducks. And thank you very much. And we came in with enough time for. So I'm going to take a stack. If you want to make a comment, Rachel, and that includes, by the way, anybody who wants to say, Cobb, you are full of bunk. I totally welcome that because I'm sure that there's somebody out here who came just to watch the freak. And I would be totally welcome to get engaged in dialogue. So if you'd raise your hand, you'll be number one. I've wowed the crowd. I have one comment. Two. We'll start there. Yes, sir.
David Cobb, you are the mad king and everybody else is insane. Question. I noticed that you used the word corporatist to describe the ruling elite or the ruling powers in America today. And as Mussolini noted, that was probably the more accurate word for the word fascism. Could you talk about your choice of those two words and
I will.
Call fascism what it is?
Well, it's interesting. And I thank you for the question. And it is, in fact, true. The gentleman is correct. Mussolini said famously, fascism should be more accurately called corporatism because it fuses the economic might of the private corporation with the political and military might of the state. And so fusing those two together, he said, and of course remember, he was a defender and a vocal and proud apologist for fascism. He wasn't trying he was proud of being a fascist, but he was honestly saying really more accurately it's corporatist. The reason that I actually use the word corporatist rather than fascist is because I'm trying to communicate. And I do think it's sort of like if I were to say, I am an anarcho-syndicalist. Anarcho-syndicalists unite! Then maybe 3 or 4 of us would get together in the coffee shop and have an interesting conversation. And frankly, I'm not merely interested in being right. I want to be right, but I want to win. And so I use the word corporatist because I think, not just because it's a word that people can accept, but it's one that they can hear and has some meaning for them. For so many people, if I were to say, the Bush administration is fascist, or this country is fascist, they would immediately reject it and say, that's like anything else that you say doesn't make sense. Now, some people might immediately say, thank goodness somebody's willing to tell the truth. So that's the reason that I use the word. But since you've outed me, I would say absolutely. I mean, I choose the word because I'm trying to communicate an idea. And I do think that in this country, what we've seen is the military might and the political legal justification of the state has been fused by the economic power and might of the transnational corporation, right? And in fact, so we are living in a thoroughly and utterly corporate-controlled society. And I think it's interesting too. I mean, since you sort of asked the question about the corporation, I'm going to take this moment to very quickly give you sort of my sense of my U.S. Constitution class in 5 minutes. Ready? So the U.S. Constitution, you've read it, right? So I will suggest that document, which of course is the charter for this government, right? It's the supreme law of the land. It basically describes the relationship between we the people and government. Interesting to note that corporations are nowhere listed in the Constitution. Something that we might suggest to those folks who claim to be strict interpretationists, that perhaps the Founding Fathers did not expect the corporation to play any meaningful role in the body politic. Something to think about for the Federalist Society. We the people in this framework are described as free and sovereign. Government is subordinate and accountable. Subordinate to whom? It's a gimme, y'all. Who? The people. Accountable to whom? It's another gimme. In fact, in this framework, all legitimate power resides with the people. Only a certain amount of that power is delegated to government. In fact, only the amount necessary, because we the people in this constitutional framework are described as possessing individual rights, political civil rights. Government is described as having collective duties. And of course, for folks at a law school would know that the entire dynamic between having rights and duties is the very definition of law under at least the Anglo-Saxon products. To legally have a right to do something means that I can do it even if all the rest of you don't like it. I don't need your permission. I can simply do it. If I want to marry a man, I would say I have the right to do it inherently, innately, because of my dignity as a human being. And I don't need your permission, and frankly, I don't need the permission of the state. And if the state is saying that I need their permission, that's because the state is wrong, and they will ultimately catch up to me. Remember my sort of comment about how I will ultimately win? I am here to tell you, as certainly as God made little green apples, that same-sex marriages are going to be recognized in the United States of America as a matter of fundamental human rights. I guarantee it. You can clap for that. I guarantee it. So in this framework, we the people have rights, government has duties, and at its core level, we the people never have a legally enforceable duty to government. Government never has rights over the people. And I look at that and I think, that is fantastic. This is brilliant, in fact. We should try that in this country. I think it might work. And I am totally serious about that. What I love about it is it understands and appreciates and acknowledges the role of the private person, the private individual, which is sacrosanct. As a human being, by my mere presence, your mere presence, you have inalienable rights that God, the goddess, the cosmos, however you think about it, your very existence endows you with certain rights. And frankly, if government action tries to intrude upon certain of those rights, then government, in so doing, is illegitimate. Right? But this framework also understands that there is a public component to our work, or to our reality, to our existence. That there is a communitarian part of this. So I'm not a strict civil libertarian, because what I realize is when acting in the private sphere, I must always be allowed to engage in my rights. However, that there is a public component and there's an interchange. That's why I think that the U.S. theory of government is so brilliant. Before I wax poetic anymore, though, about how great the U.S. Constitution is, another pop quiz. What year was the U.S. Constitution either drafted or ratified?
1787.
87 was the Constitutional Convention, ratified in 1789. And so, in 1787, 1789, my question is, who are we the people in this incredible setup? White. Had to be white. Had to be a man. Had to be a property owner. Oh, and check this out. This is actually something, so I'll just do that symbol for money. You know what I only recently found out? That in order to actually be allowed to vote, not only did you have to be a property owner, but if you wanted to vote in local elections, you had to own a certain amount of land. If you wanted to vote in statewide offices in most states, you had to own even more land. So they literally tied the franchise voting rights to the whole notion of how much land you had, right? And so this sort of whole framework, and I remember this was about corporations, right? So some folks would say, all right, Cobb, fair enough, you've got a critique about the fact, and let me just say it very clearly. The founding of this country is a founding violence. It's a founding violence, obviously, against the indigenous people who were subjected to genocidal policies of annihilation, right? That's a founding violence psychically that continues to reverberate. It's a founding violence against the black folks who were brought from Africa in chains as human slaves. And I don't think that today we can fully grapple, certainly as a white person, I'll be very clear and honest, I can't even get my head around the notion of slavery and just how depraved that is. I don't know that many people today, white or black or brown or anything else, can really fully understand just how sick and disgusting that institution was, but it was the institution that drove the entire social, political, economic institutions of their day. So do not do specifically define the duties that they have, why they had to exist. And originally the corporation in this country for the first 75 years had to always act in the public interest. I am suggesting that properly understood, the corporation has to be on this side of the line. But in 1886, when the Supreme Court says, no, a corporation should be legally considered a person with political and civil rights, it basically perverts this entire framework. It means that it is basically legalized and enfranchised a kind of corporatism. And it means that the corporation, even though it is nothing more than accumulation of capital, right? I mean, so you've all been through at least enough law school to know that the brainwashing has begun, and a corporation doesn't really exist, right? It's really a legal fiction. We're going to pretend like it really exists, but it doesn't really. And I don't know, maybe somebody in this room was like, wait a minute, what the hell are you talking about? I went along with it. Okay, it's a legal fiction. We'll just go up. Oh, the corporation is a person. Okay. That's just stupid. Right? It's just stupid. And to think that accumulated capital can somehow claim political rights perverts any notion of democracy. It basically enshrines and protects the ruling elite's institutions and makes it very difficult for we the people to engage in economic democracy at all. It's a very long answer to why corporatist instead of fascist, but there it is. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about the voter ID laws that are being challenged. I mean, like in Indiana right now in the case of Petition for Third.
I can. And in fact, this is another, so here I am, critiquing the practice of law, and, one of my, not only do I engage in electoral politics and do I vote and run for office, but as a lawyer, let me tell you the three most delightful words: sue the bastards. Right? And I am dead serious, because every tool in the toolbox needs to be used, and the voter ID laws are particularly reprehensible because it is an attempt to circumvent and reinstitute a kind of Jim Crow segregation, only this time based on class, not just race. It's interesting, of course, that it always seems to fall disproportionately on people of color, but mostly low-income people as well. And so I think it'll be very interesting to see. I'll be very clear, though, I am not very confident, given this Supreme Court, exactly how they're going to justify it. Because I look back, so they basically gutted Brown versus Board of Education, right? This court did. And they claimed that they were doing it, in the best spirit of King. These people are nuts. I don't know how else... But let me tell you this. So yes, sue the bastards. Yes, run for office. But I am really serious. Throughout all of history, the amount of justice that a lawyer is able to get in court will be very commensurate to the amount of uproar that's happening in the streets outside. Right? Because let me ask you something. In Brown versus Board of Education, do you think that those 9 racist white men went to bed as racist and then woke up as enlightened social justice activists the next day? I mean, do we even really think that Thurgood Marshall made some brilliant legal argument that nobody had thought of before? I mean, I don't want to take anything away from Thurgood Marshall. I mean, and in fact, I want to give Thurgood Marshall the real credit that he deserves. Because the real credit Thurgood Marshall deserves was not arguing Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, but for the U.S. Supreme Court. The real credit that Thurgood Marshall deserves is the 20 years that he had spent working with the NAACP and the Anti-Lynching League in fusing a legal strategy that was also part of an organizing strategy that was actually building a social movement so powerful and so strong that it simply could not be ignored any further. All right? So what do I think is going to happen? Yeah, this court accepted cert on that case. And I think that a bad decision is going to be rendered. But I also think that what that means is for those of us who do want racial justice, those of us who do want to see elections as a place where people can actually engage in trying to make their lives better, what we now need to do is go back and take up the gauntlet and take up the challenge and elect new people in those states and change those laws. I mean, I wish I had some sort of pithy legal analysis to show why there was a bulletproof case, why the voter ID laws would be held unconstitutional. But after seeing what they did with those cases in Seattle around the Brown versus Board of Education case and the outright just absolute flawed logic that they were willing to engage in, I have absolutely no faith or confidence in this court. None. None. Yes, sir. So the question was about the role of the corporation, and especially looking at the U.S. Constitution, the charters, and then the prohibition in the Constitution about titles of nobility. And I'll be very honest, sir. No, we actually haven't looked at that particular idea, but I will. And I think that it is actually a very insightful observation. And I'm not being sycophantic. I'm very serious. And I would also underscore that we should not expect that sort of logical thinking or good legal analysis is going to get us out of the dilemma that we're in as it relates to the corporations, right? Because again, this notion, these sort of core principles that we've been talking about, I believe that they are timeless and real. But I also believe that the elites are using the legal system to simply justify their raw power. And frankly, they always have. I mean, remember that the courts were the same institutions. Let's back up a moment. Remember that the legal justification that a corporation is a person with constitutional rights, what's particularly odious about that is that they used the 14th Amendment in order to justify that. The 14th Amendment about equal protection and due process of the laws, right? And so the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, after the case of Minor versus Happersett, there was a group of people in the 14th Amendment who said, wait a minute, this is pretty interesting. No person shall be denied equal protection of the law. Well, we as women think that all these state laws preventing us from voting are denying us equal protection of the law. So they went through the court system, sued at the local district court level. It got appealed. It got appealed all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court, of course, said women are not persons as understood by the 14th Amendment. That case, Minor versus Happersett, is the Supreme Court's determination, or was at the time. About 8 years later, they said, oh, but corporations are persons for purposes of the 14th Amendment. So again, I mean, I think that this idea of titles of nobility has some rich opportunity for dialogue, but I don't think that we're going to craft a legal opinion that's going to get us out of it. I think that what's going to happen, the reason that my side, again, will ultimately prevail over the corporatism is because it's justice. And I do believe that justice prevails in the end. And I do think that I look back again on all the other examples, and I do think that there will be some lawyers, a la Thurgood Marshall, who are engaged in, thoughtful legal brief writing, trying. The whole notion of states' rights, like, I have a visceral reaction to that, right? It's like, ugh, because that's the thing that I'm most scared of. Well, in democracy, what are you going to say, that the states have the right to engage in violating other people's rights? To which I say no. That's why there's, even if the state apparatus is acting inappropriately according to our understanding of fundamental human rights and civil liberties, they're wrong. But do you know what the original states' rights fight was in this country? It was the right of Wisconsin and Minnesota and other Midwest states to refuse to obey the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. Wisconsin came within a few votes of seceding from the Union over slavery. There's a fantastic story of Asa Glover, who was a self-liberated person. I don't even like to say runaway slave, right? Because that doesn't really capture. This was a self-liberated person. A human being who got away from the institutions that illegitimately and immorally held him in bondage. And he escaped to Wisconsin. He was playing cards. He had become actually a respected member of the community. And a bunch of slave catchers broke in the middle of the night, grabbed him, said that they had the legal warrants to do it, and then took him into the jail. And within a matter of just days, the wide awakes, they were called, which I love, the wide awakes. Why? Because they were wide awake against incursions into their community by these slave catchers under the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. Right? And so the wide awakes circled around Wisconsin. They gathered over 1,000 people into the streets of Racine, Wisconsin. And in a story that warms the cockles of my heart, you did a little citizen legislating. And in fact, not only citizen legislating, but they wrote, and this is a true story, they wrote the writ of open sesame and delivered it to the jailers. And that writ actually said it would be unjust and immoral to have this man jailed on the Sabbath whenever he has done nothing wrong. Therefore, we demand that you open the prison doors and release him to us. And in fact, because the movement for abolition had grown so broad and so deep, the jailers themselves said, well, the federal courts are saying this, but these people are saying this, and the Wisconsin state legislature backed the play. In other words, not only did Asa Glover get released and was actually shipped away to Canada to ultimate freedom and was never actually returned to bondage, but with the Wisconsin state legislature then actually wrote a law that said we're not going to uphold the Federal Fugitive Slave Act here. The Supreme Court wrote them back and said you had to. The Wisconsin Supreme Court took it up and backed the play. The Wisconsin governor at the time actually had an assessment done of the National Guard to find out how many of the units in the National Guard, should we secede, will actually support Wisconsin and how many will go with the U.S. government. They found that only one would go in with the U.S. government, and do you know what the Wisconsin governor did? He disbanded that unit. Now that's a movement. And frankly, I want to be part of a movement like that. All right, thanks so much, y'all. I see some people leaving. I'll stick around if anybody wants to ask some questions, because I know some people don't like to do it. Thank you so much for coming. Get active, get involved. Let's take our country back. Peace.